All right, so we have our images. Now we want to actually create an asset manager. So when we load, we will only have one usage. If we continue to, and before we try to run anything, we need to actually switch this back to desktop. Because texture packer or any other asset that we use, if we don't have an asset manager, and what an asset manager does is it basically creates, when you have asset manager manage your assets, it makes sure that you only ever have one instance of that asset. You don't have a bunch of them floating around. It makes it easier, one, for disposing of those assets, because Asset Manager can dispose of those assets once they're being done used. All you have to do is just call dispose. And it helps optimize our game because we don't have so many instances of Asset Manager. Now, one thing that I ended up having issues with, and I didn't realize right away, if you are creating an asset manager and it is static, especially for phone type games, you're going to have all kinds of issues when you lose focus on the game. So if you minimize the game and you went to another app and you come back to it, it's going to dispose but not dispose properly. You're going to end up having assets that are kind of lost, and your game will not operate correctly. So one thing that you need to make sure when you are doing an asset manager is that you are correctly setting up your assets. So let's go to our main game. So I have my Redbeard run. And let's minimize. We're going to minimize that and that and that. Okay. So right now, all we have is basically where we are setting the different screens, and then we're going to them, and we eventually get to our game. Okay. We are going to add a little bit more. We are already passing the sprite batch to, so we only have one sprite batch, and we're passing that to all of the different screens. Let's go ahead and do that with the asset manager. Okay, now the asset manager, we only want one copy and we don't want it accessible anywhere else. So I'm going to go ahead and create an asset manager, and asset manager, and we are ultimately going to create our own asset manager that we're going to pass in that asset manager, and then we can set some stuff. So public my asset manager, okay, and we don't have that created yet. I am going to go ahead and create that because that's a manager. I'm going to go ahead and create it in my managers. So let's create a new class. And then they're going to call it my asset manager. All right. So in my asset manager, there's a couple of things that we want to do. So let's go ahead and put a tag so that we can reference it for any issues. Static final string tag equals my asset manager dot class dot get simple name. Okay, so now we can refer to it when we print out. We know that this asset manager is basically going to be kind of an extension of the regular asset manager. So let's go ahead and we're going to pass in that manager. And so that means that our constructor is going to require the asset manager, and we're going to set it. And so now we're going to start building some methods. Okay, there are a number of things that we need to use an asset manager, a number of methods that we're going to do so that we can ultimately link this up into our loading screen, and we could have it show that it's loading all of the files correctly into Asset Manager. So let's start building them. The first one that we want to do is when we unload assets, so we're going to either load or we're going to unload assets. So we need to start creating some methods. So let's do an unload asset, and we could just pass in, say, a string asset file path. And first we're going to check. So if we are all done with our asset manager, we want to make sure that if we need to unload the asset, that it's already been loaded, so it doesn't error out. So if asset manager is loaded, and then we can pass in that asset file path, then we want to unload the asset. So I'm just telling the asset manager to unload asset file path. Okay. Otherwise, if that is not true, it doesn't have that file, then we need to actually log. So I'm going to do gdx.app.input log tag and say asset is not in memory, and then we want to know what that file path was so we can check. Okay, and then we're going to start creating a bunch of methods. We want to know when it has finished loading something, like all of the files, so that we can start looking at that and using that in our load screen. So let's add a bunch. We're not going to use them all right away. Float load completed, and then all this is going to do is this is going to allow us to check the progress. It's going to return it as a float value, get progress. So if we see what that method is, okay, so I'm in the asset manager. If it's going to give us a number between 1 and 0. 0 being it's not loaded, 1 it's being fully loaded. Now I have found that there are some issues dealing with this, that it's never actually going to get to 1 before it switches over, so we just need to be mindful of that. Okay, so we want to use this method basically for when it is done loading, or as it's loading, we can use that for a progress bar as we're doing loading states. Let's see, what else do we want? Load completed. We want to know how many assets maybe are queued to get loaded. Number of assets queued, UED. And really, I'm just pulling the methods from the asset manager so we can see queued assets. We can just access it directly. We want to have it update. So if we are actually stopping it loading, there's two ways that we can load. We can load all of them at once, or we can do asynchronous loading. So progress bars, you'd want to use asynchronous. If you didn't and you wanted it to block until it finishes loading, you wouldn't be able to use a progress bar, and it basically is just kind of freezing everything until it finishes. So when we test, we can do it where it's blocking, but ultimately we want to do a progress bar. So when we get to our loading screen, that's when we're going to change it. Update asset loading, and we want to return asset manager dot update. Okay, now I can use this to tell me if it's true that it's updating. Update. All right, let's do another method. Public Boolean is asset loaded string, and then I need that file name. Return asset manager dot is loaded, and I pass in that file name. Okay, and then this method, what I'm ultimately going to do is before I try actually linking up and setting an asset, I can double check to make sure that it is loaded before it tries running it or pulling it. Now we need to, because we're using tiled, we're using a texture packer, we're using fonts, we're going to end up having to put, and ultimately we're also going to be doing particles. We're going to have to create a couple custom load for assets. So let's do we're going to just do a couple right now. Let's do the map one first. Okay, so public void load map asset. Okay, and we need that string map. Let's just do file path. File path. Okay, so when you're doing custom ones, it allows us to have a file handle resolver that we can set specifically for how we want to load things. So the load map asset, first we're going to need to check if that file path for the map, if it's not there, it doesn't exist, or we need to check if the file path is empty, so there's nothing in it. We're not going to be able to load it. So let's just go ahead and return. Okay. If it's not that, then we can go ahead and start loading that asset. So we need to use the asset manager, and each asset manager does have a file handle resolver. So how we load our files, we can have it load specific things. You'll see that more once we get into playing around with fonts. Okay, so we want to use the file handle resolver, and we want to resolve that file, file path, and then we want to make sure that it exists. Okay, and then we are going to do asset manager dot, and then we're going to set how we're loading it. So we need to set a loader. This is basically saying how we are getting the information, what type it is going to be. So when we load a map, since we're using that tiled, it's going to be a tiled map. So I'm going to put that as my type, and then I need to do a new TMX map loader. Why do you not like that? All right, so now it recognizes it. And we're going to get it from asset manager.getFileHandleResolver. Okay. So after that, then asset manager dot load, and then we want to load that file path. So we're saying that we're loading it as a tiled map. We're loading the file path, and then we need to pass in the type. So tiled map dot class. So when asset manager, it doesn't really care what files you load, but when you do load a file in asset manager, you need to let it know what type it's holding so that when you pass it, it's not going to error out. Okay, now we can choose for, so here we are going to block to finish loading all at once. Okay, so this code will eventually change because we want it to just update, but we can just right now do finish loading. We can have it finish loading everything or finish loading that asset. So in this case, I want it to finish loading that asset, so I'm going to do that file path. Okay, now this is blocking the code. All right, now I am going to pass in a couple .app.log. I want to know which one it's loaded. Map loaded, and then I want that file path. Okay, if it cannot resolve that file, then we need to find out what's going on. So gdx.app.log tag map doesn't exist, and we've got to deal with it. File path. Okay, so that is pretty much our loading of the asset. Now we need to be able to get the asset. So let's do a getter for it. Public, and it's going to get a tiled map. Get map asset. We need to give it a string file path. Okay, so this is where we are checking if that method is there. Okay, so if asset manager dot is loaded, and then we pass in that file path, then we can go ahead and actually return that. So let me go ahead and, well, let's just go ahead and return it. Return asset manager dot get file path dot tiled map dot class. All right. Yep. Okay. Otherwise, we got some issues. So else, if it's not loaded, we don't want to actually try to run it. So gdx.app.log tag map is not loaded file path. Okay. And we're still going to have to return something. So this, because we're making sure that it has it before we try to get it, we need to have something so that it's going to not crash it. But so let's do it. A tiled map map equals null. And then this we're going to set as the map and return it. Return, oops, map equals. stored as the map, and then we're returning the map. Otherwise, we're returning a null map. Okay, so those are our two methods for our asset manager. Now we need to finish actually linking it up at the very start. So when we create the screen, we have our asset manager and our my asset manager that we didn't actually set up yet. But when we get here, this is where we're creating our batch. We need to actually create the asset manager. So let's go asset manager equals new asset manager. And this is where I'm going to use the internal file handle resolver. I'm going to have it create one so that it can manage the types of files. And then I need to create my asset manager. With new my asset manager that is going to require that asset manager. Okay, so now I have this asset manager. What am I going to do with it? Well, we're going to require every screen that is going to need to have. So when we create the screen, we're going to have it pass in not just the batch, but we're going to also have it pass in the asset manager. Okay, so we have this, we have batch. Let's do my asset manager. It's going to freak out. That's okay. My asset manager, my asset manager, my asset manager. All right, so each one of these, the loading screen, let's go to it. Loading screen right now only requires a batch in the game. I'm going to pass in the asset manager. Okay, and then we need to set it. So if for our loading screen, let's do private my asset manager, and then let's set it. So this dot my asset manager equals my asset manager. All right, so that fixes the issue for that one. We have to do that for every single screen. Okay, so we did the loading screen. Let's go ahead and do the menu screen. Again, same thing. Private my asset manager. I'm going to change this, add it to it, and then we need to assign it. So this dot my asset manager equals my asset manager. 2 down. And game screen. Setting out the top private my asset manager. Asset manager. Add it to the constructor. And then we have to set it this dot my asset manager equals my asset manager. And one more. Quit screen. Super fun. My asset manager, my asset manager. This dot my asset manager equals my asset manager. All right, so we have dealt with the issues. What is the issue that we have right now? All right, So if we run this, we should have no errors, but we are still missing some stuff. We haven't linked up anything. None of those methods are used. All right. So right now we are loading that map. I'm doing the test map, but you're going to be using your map. We need to actually start loading that with an asset manager. Okay. And we could do that through the loading screen instead of doing it in our game. So let's go look at where we have the map actually loaded. Okay, so right here we are loading the map, and then we're passing it in as a map renderer. So this TMX map loader that we're loading the map, we're loading it directly here, but this is where we want to actually implement with asset management. Okay, so we want to start offloading that work. Okay, so in our load screen is where we want to go. Double checking my notes. Okay, so let's go to our load screen. Right now we're not loading anything, but we're going to start setting it up. So as soon as the loading screen is created, that is where we want to start using our asset manager. It's not really doing much right now, but we want to load that stuff. Let's create a method for this first. I'm going to create a private method to load all of our assets. So let's do private void, let's call it loading map assets. All right, and okay. So the first thing that we would want to do is for maps is that we want to call that my asset manager, and then we want to load the map asset. So we're going to use that method that we just did, and now we are going to pass in the file that we have. So right now this test map.tmx, that's what I'm going to go ahead and load, but you guys could load whatever map. If you have multiple maps, you are probably going to want to look at your folder structure. So that is actually just directly in the assets folder. So that's my file path. Test map.tmx. Okay, so it's going to look really similar to main game screen, test map.tmx. Okay, because we're passing in that when it loads, it's loading it with the TMX map loader. So this would load the map, and then we could run this load map asset. Let's look at my asset manager, what it's doing. Okay, this is checking if it's this, there's no issues, then it's going to block the loading until it's done. Okay, so in a loading screen, we know that we're going to eventually have it finish up. Right now, I might change this a little bit later, but after we have it started, all we have to do is we just have to check if it's loaded, and then we could give it a name, so something like this. So if we were doing progress, we could have it check. We don't need to continually check if it has been loaded, but we could check that if the asset manager, so my asset manager dot is asset loaded, and pass in that file path, which in this case would be that tests map.tmx. Okay, so what we could do with this eventually is that we could check if it is loaded. If it is loaded, then I could have some string that I'm building and say, let's call it like a loading file. I could have it running a tally and say that map, let's say map plus file path. Actually, you know what? Something like this. Test map.tmx. Dot. Done. Okay. I could have it say something like that, and then it switches to the next stage that I need for loading my stuff. Okay. Depending on how we wanted to do it. Since we're not really there yet, I'm just going to have it block, and it's just going to load. So if I have multiple map assets, I'm going to assign them once, and then I'm done. Okay, so where would that happen? That would happen in my render. We have it right now where it's pausing to wait, and it's decreasing that time, and then it sets the menu. Okay. So if it is less than 0, then it is setting the screen to the menu, and we're done. Okay. Now this render, it's basing off of delta. So I'm using that time is when I'm going to end up loading my assets. So let's do let's load our assets. So my asset manager dot load map asset. Oops, that's not what I want. Loading map asset. There we go. Okay. So here, let me just add a comment. Currently blocking while loading maps. All right. So I'm loading the map. Once it's done, I'm basically pausing everything, and then once it finishes, then it's going to continue down here, and it's going to finish going through the time right now. Okay, so then I want to actually plug in and use it. So in the main game screen, we are already passing that asset manager. So then what I need to do is, instead of loading it this way, we need to find it. So my asset manager dot get map asset, and this one is in this case tests map.tmx. That is the file name that I'm using to pull it, or the file path to get access to it. And I could name it probably a couple different ways. So now this is loading by the asset manager, and I'm not loading it in the game screen. I loaded it before. So let's run this, make sure that it doesn't give us any errors. Boop, 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 boop. All right, doesn't look any different. Now let's look at what we got. Okay. We went in the loading screen, resize, render, time to wait, and it says my asset manager map loaded, test map.tmx. Okay. Time's still going down, but we are loading that test map.tmx. Let's go and print out or log. And I want some of this stuff to kind of go away. We don't really need to see that time anymore. Loading screen render method. We can go ahead and keep that. I'm going to take off the log for the time to wait and the main screen main menu render. I'm just going to comment that out because we don't need to see everything. Let's comment that out. Loading screen. We don't need to see this anymore. We don't need to see this. Okay. So we want to see the progress. So when it's calling this, I want to see the progress. So my asset manager dot get progress. Let's see. It's that load completed. This is what I want to actually print out. So gdx.app.log tag my asset manager.load completed. Okay. And that's just going to give us a number. Let's go ahead and run this again. Let's stop. Okay. Now what do we see? It doesn't actually go through. It's just showing 0. Now it continues to call the same method because ideally if we weren't blocking the code, it would go through systematically and this number would show up as more than 1 because it's blocking. But we want, if we were having it where it was going through on the progress, because once it's fit and finished, then it's just done. So let's go to the asset manager. And if we did not have it blocking, so if I commented this out and then went and ran it again, so now it's doing asynchronous loading. Actually, we need to tell it to update. Oh, hold on. Load. Okay, so I didn't tell it to update on the loading. So once it actually got to it, because I wasn't blocking it, now it's telling me my asset manager map is not loaded. That's what it tried to access, and it's giving me a null pointer exception because it didn't block, it just continued on. This is where when you do load assets, you don't want it to be able to access it without having it. So that progress in our asset manager, we need to ensure that it's continuing to load that asset. So if we are not blocking it out, then we need to continually tell it to update, which is what this is, update asset loading. All right, so if we call it, and let's say we didn't do it here, okay, and we did it when we originally got into our show, we automatically load our map, and here we check. So this would be my asset manager dot update asset loading. Okay, so then it's going to run and it's going to start ticking up. And my time to wait, I am decreasing this so I have a time, but I'm going to also add, say, my asset manager dot is asset loaded. And of course I can do this a couple different ways, but this would be tests map.tmx. Make sure that I named it right. Okay, so it should not get in here unless it's finished. Let's go ahead and run, and that main menu screen, that render is really annoying me. Let's run it. Let's see what it does. Okay, now it worked. It did not error out. Okay, it is showing 0 on the loading screen, and then it ended up, when it finished, it went to the resize. So there are some stuff that we got to do for getting that progress to show us correctly, but it did not, because we were loading it asynchronous. So all we were doing in the render was telling it to update. I need to be in the loading screen. We're telling it to update each loading to make sure that it's on there. If it's not finished, it needs to go ahead and load some more. And then we are having it not setting the menu even though it's loading. So if we were printing out that time again to run, we can see if it time finished before it ran or not. Okay, so the timer went below 0, but that map was not done loading, so it waited until the map was done loading. Okay, so that's a little bit of asynchronous, and we can see it kind of working, but now we have set it up for our map. So we need to do that for our textures and all of our other stuff, start loading those animation pieces in. And I'm going to stop this video, and the next video we're going to start loading our assets, our texture packer and stuff in the loading screen. All right, good luck, have fun.